Trip to MB Freude. So I just got back from MB Freude, or Mercedes Freude, in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And I'm going to do two videos. One is going to talk about our trip and how it went. And the other one is going to talk about the event, and I'm going to give an honest assessment of the event. And so we're going to start with the video about how the trip went with the cars we brought. So there were 4 cars that came from my shop, or attempted to come from my shop. 3 made it there and back without any major incidents, and then 1 got 22 miles down the road and did not quite make it. And so, well, let's see where we are. The 3 cars that went up there and back were a 1971 280 SE, otherwise known as Kinji Benz, which you guys have probably seen if you're in any of the 108 groups or you're following our Instagram. The other car was my good friend Tony's 300 SEL 6.3, and there's an interview with him where he talks about this car and what it means to him and how excited he has been to own it. And then a third car was my I have another customer named Dennis, and he's a really great person to work with too. And so he and I worked hard to put this 300 SE convertible back on the road. And ordinarily these are pretty expensive cars, but this one came about because most people who saw this thing were scared of it having sat for 25 years or so, and at some point it was just pushed into a corner when it didn't run anymore, and the fuel tank rusted and the air suspension valves quit working, and that was that. So we drove, Tony and Joe and who owns Kinji and I drove together, and then Dennis and his wife commuted up there on Thursday and came back early Monday morning ahead of us. In addition, I drove my 1985 300 TD, and I consider the 300 TD to be a control variable because other than having to change one primary fuel filter as a precaution, not because it was having any issues, the car did extremely well, and the only issue I had with it were vacuum locks. So let's look at each car. Let's start with Kinji Benz, and then we'll talk about the last car that broke down, of course. So Kinji Benz, 71 280 SE, off the road since 1993. We did a lot of work to this car, including at the last minute a front crankshaft seal. And this car had had an undiagnosed problem that caused it to be parked, which I think was related to a speed relay. In addition, it benefited from a 3.27 axle conversion. While there were some issues that may have been caused by the car sitting for a few years, such as hard shifting or some inconsistency with start time, the car drove up there and back flawlessly. It took 3/4 of a tank to get it up there and 3/4 of a tank of fuel to get it back. So the fact that the car covered the entire distance from my shop to Hilton Head Island and still had fuel left over is really quite remarkable and indicates that it is running extremely well. I don't know how many miles are on this car. I think it's about 125,000, but I can't be 100% certain. Still, the car ran and drove flawlessly. A lot of the repairs that we did turned out well. Everything from the climate control to the belts to the fuel system did exactly what they were supposed to do, and the car didn't even use any oil. The only in-trip failure we suffered was a broken hood cable, and it broke inside the cabin and not under the hood. So the next car was the 6.3. Now, 6.3s are not easy cars to deal with. The first problem we had was that the evaporator drain tube sealed itself shut from all the heat in the transmission tunnel and caused a deluge when the evaporator case overflowed. So what I did was I trimmed the end of the tube and made sure it wasn't sitting on the transmission, and that solved that issue. The next issue that I ran into with this car was setting the pump mixture. And Michael Morris was kind enough to look at the car and told me that he thought the mixture was lean. Well, he was right. I initially thought the mixture was too rich, but I also hadn't driven the car for 3 hours. And it really takes, if you have a 6.3, it takes 2 to 3 hours of driving for the car to really hit its peak temperatures to where everything is going to work right, because the governor in the injection pump, even the governor in the injection pump, is sensitive to oil temperature. Even then, you know, and that's how these cars are. So for the pump to fully warm up, the pump thermostat to lean the mixture out all the way, that is a very, very critical thing about 6.3s. You really should refrain from making mixture adjustments until the car is fully warmed up. Now, another thing about this car that really was challenging was cold starting. So the starting solenoid on the injection pump helps start the car when it's cold, but even when it's barely moving the pump rack when it's warm, it overfuels the engine and causes it to choke and stumble and die. But it starts perfectly with the solenoid disconnected when it's warm. So what do? First cold start of the day, do you wait a little bit longer and give it a little bit of throttle? Or do you know, I don't know. I'm still figuring out this issue, but eventually I will figure out a conclusion to it. The good news is that the car was extremely reliable. We had no breakdowns. We had no failures to start, failures to proceed, and everything went quite well with that car. Now, the 300 SE, you'd think that this car would probably have an issue somewhere. And it did, but they were not major. There were two issues. The first one was quite minor. The back end was sitting too low. I had to adjust it so that with Dennis and his wife and their luggage and a full tank of fuel, the ride height was healthy, balanced. The second issue was a little bit more scary. When Dennis arrived in Hilton Head Island, the pump was leaking, the electric fuel pump was leaking. And so these pumps are a total submersion design. The pump fills with gasoline. There's no separation between the impeller chamber and the electric motor. So what I did with Dennis's pump was I looked at it to try to ascertain where the leaks were, and I ended up tightening the screw between the two terminals. What did this do? It put more pressure on the terminal O-rings. And when I did this, the leak pretty much stopped. And then after it sat overnight, it totally stopped. So not only was Dennis extremely grateful, I was assured that there would not be a massive fuel leak. Otherwise, this car ran and drove extremely well and needed 1 quart of oil just like the 6.3 did. And that was that. The last car, 1970 300 SEL 6.3. This car is a very, very difficult thing for me to talk about because at the last minute we discovered the air suspension compressor bracket was cracked. I knew the car had a major oil leak that I could not trace. I traced it to a crack in the bracket, which was hard to spot because it's like everything else in the 6.3, hard to see, hard to analyze, and the leak was only occurring at high engine speeds. We pulled the bracket off, got it welded on Monday, got it installed Tuesday before I left. Car was running. I was quite happy. However, there were some problems afterward where when my customer decided to pick it up, albeit at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday because his flight was delayed, it stopped running 22 miles outside of our shop. So thankfully, Jesse, who was kind of a night owl, was willing to go see what was wrong with the car. And in the meantime, the owner of the car called AAA. I thought about what it might have gone wrong, and Jesse and I troubleshot over the phone, and we found out that one of the ignition point sets was just not doing its thing. It was not making contact or working or whatever. And so because of this problem, the car had quit running, and we ended up putting some new points in it after the car got back to the shop. So we did get it running, and then but the owner elected to tow it back to the shop, and guess what happened? After we put new points in, it didn't want to start at all. So who knows what the heck is going on? I can't be sure either. One of the problems with driving a 6.3, especially one that was parked from 1991 to approximately 2016, is that you never know where trouble might strike. And that's why when taking a long trip, it might be good to go in a group. Well, in this case, you know, going out by yourself at night was something I might do, but probably was not a good idea for me to recommend to my customer to do. So that's that. That's how things go sometimes, though, when you have a 6.3. Anyway, in the next part of the video, I'm going to discuss the event. I'm going to give it my pros and cons, because everything has pros and cons. So if you plan this event or you were involved with getting it up and going, just listen, because I don't have anything really terrible to say. It was actually a lot of fun, and I enjoyed myself. And we will talk, well, we'll talk in the comments, but I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.